Welcome to Snoozecast, the podcast designed to help you fall asleep. On Snoozecast, we read excerpts from public domain works and occasionally original stories. We'd like to thank our listeners. If you enjoy our show, please review us on Apple Podcasts and also share it with a friend. The best place to listen to us is on our website, snoozecast.com. That way, you can play a single episode and fall asleep without another one automatically playing. This episode is supported by the ambiance created by softly glowing lamps in the dark. Tonight, I'll be reading from the beginning of a book called Viking Tales, written in 1902 by Jenny Hall. This book is focused around the story of Harald Farhair, first king of Norway around the year 900, but also draws upon sagas and other sources to produce a view of Viking life. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Part 1. The Baby. King Halfdan lived in Norway long ago. One morning, his queen said to him, "I had a strange dream last night. I thought that I stood in the grass before my bower. I pulled a thorn from my dress. As I held it in my fingers, it grew into a tall tree. The trunk was thick and red as blood, but the lower limbs were fair and green, and the highest ones were white. I thought that the branches of this great tree spread so far that they covered all Norway and even more." "A strange dream," said King Halfdan. "Dreams are the messengers of the gods. I wonder what they would tell us." And he stroked his beard in thought. Some time after that, a serving woman came into the feast hall where King Halfdan was. She carried a little white bundle in her arms. "My lord," she said, "a little son is just born to you." "Ha!" cried the king, and he jumped up from the high seat and hastened forward until he stood before the woman. "Show him to me," he shouted, and there was joy in his voice. The serving woman put down her bundle on the ground and turned back the cloth. There was a little naked baby. The king looked at it carefully. "It is a goodly youngster," he said, and smiled. "Bring Ivar and Thorstein." They were captains of the king's soldiers. Soon they came. "Stand as witnesses," Halfdan said. Then he lifted the baby in his arms, while the old serving woman brought a silver bowl of water. The king dipped his hand into it and sprinkled the baby, saying, "I own this baby for my son. He shall be called Harald. My naming gift to him is 10 pounds of gold." Then the woman carried the baby back to the queen's room. "My lord owns him for his son," she said, "and no wonder. He is perfect in every limb." The queen looked at him and smiled and remembered her dream and thought, "That great tree, can it be this little baby of mine?" The Tooth Thrall. When Harald was 7 months old, he cut his first tooth. Then his father said, "All the young of my herds, lambs and calves and colts, that have been born since this baby was born, I this day give to him. I also to him this thrall, Olaf. These are my tooth gifts to my son." The boy grew fast, for as soon as he could walk about, he was out of doors most of the time. He ran in the woods and climbed the hills and waded in the creek. He was much with his tooth thrall, for the king had said to Olaf, "Be ever at his call." Now this Olaf was full of stories, and Harald liked to hear them. "Come out to Ager's rock, Olaf, and tell me stories," he said almost every day. So they started off across the hills. The man wore a long, loose coat of white wool, belted at the waist with a strap. He had on coarse shoes and leather leggings. Around his neck was an iron collar welded together so that it could not come off. On it were strange marks, called runes, that said, "Olaf, thrall of Halfdan." But Harald's clothes were gay. A cape of gray velvet hung from his shoulders. It was fastened over his breast with great gold buckles. When it waved in the wind, a scarlet lining flashed out, and the bottom of a little scarlet jacket showed. His feet and legs were covered with gray woolen tights. Gold lacings wound around his legs, from his shoes to his knees. A band of gold held down his long, yellow hair. It was a wild country that these two were walking over. They were climbing steep, rough hills. Some of them seemed made all of rock, with a little earth lying in spots. Great rocks hung out from them, with trees growing in their cracks. Some big pieces had broken off and rolled down the hill. "Thor broke them," Olaf said. "He rides through the sky and hurls his hammer at clouds and at mountains. That makes the thunder and the lightning and cracks the hills. His hammer never misses its aim, and it always comes back to his hand and is eager to go again." When they reached the top of the hill, they looked back. Far below was a soft, green valley. In front of it, the sea came up into the land and made a fjord. On each side of the fjord, high walls of rock stood up and made the water black with shadow. All around the valley were high hills with dark pines on them. Far off were the mountains. In the valley were Halfdan's houses around their square yard. "How little our houses look down there," Harald said. "But I can almost... Yes, I can see the red dragon on the roof of the feast hall. Do you remember when I climbed up and sat on his head, Olaf?" He laughed and kicked his heels and ran on. At last they came to Agir's rock and walked up its flat top. Harald went to the edge and looked over. A ragged wall of rock reached down, and 200 feet below was the black water of the fjord. Olaf watched him for a while. Then he said, "No whitening of your cheek, Harald. Good. A boy that can face the fall of Aegir's rock will not be afraid to face the war flash when he is a man." "Ho, I am not afraid of the war flash now," cried Harald. He threw back his cape and drew a little dagger from his belt. "See," he cried, "does this not flash like a sword? And I am not afraid. But after all, this is a baby thing. When I am 8 years old, I will have a sword, a sharp tooth of war." He swung his dagger as though it were a long sword. Then he ran and sat on a rock by Olaf. "Why is this Aegir's rock?" he asked. "You know that Asgard is up in the sky," Olaf said. "It is a wonderful city where the golden houses of the gods are in the golden grove. A high wall runs all around it. In the house of Odin, the All-Father, there is a great feast hall larger than the whole earth. Its name is Valhalla. It has 500 doors. The rafters are spears. The roof is thatched with shields. Armor lies on the benches. In the high seat sits Odin, a golden helmet on his head, a spear in his hand. 2 wolves lie at his feet. At his right hand and his left sit all the gods and goddesses, and around the hall sit thousands and thousands of men, all the brave ones that have ever died. Now it is good to be in Valhalla, for there is mead there better than men can brew, and it never runs out. And there are skalds that sing wonderful songs that men never heard. And before the doors of Valhalla is a great meadow where the warriors fight every day and get glorious and sweet wounds, and give many. And all night they feast, and their wounds heal, but none may go to Valhalla except warriors that have died bravely in battle. Men who die from sickness go to Niflheim. There, Hela, who is queen, always sneers at them, and a terrible cold takes hold of their bones, and they sit down and freeze. Years ago, Aegir was a great warrior. Aegir the Big-Handed, they called him. In many a battle, his sword had sung, and he had sent many warriors to Valhalla. Many swords that bit into his flesh and left marks there, but never a one had struck him to death. So his hair grew white, and his arms thin. There was peace in that country then, and Aegir soured, saying, "I am old, battles are still. Must I die in bed? Shall I not see Valhalla?" Now thus did Odin say long ago, "If a man is old, and is come near death, and cannot die in fight, let him find death in some brave way, and he shall feast with me in Valhalla." So one day Aegir came to this rock. "A deed to win Valhalla," he cried. Then he drew his sword and flashed it over his head, and held his shield high above him, and leaped out into the air and died in the water of the fjord. "Ho!" cried Harald, jumping to his feet. I think that Odin stood up before his high seat and welcomed that man gladly when he walked through the door of Valhalla. "So the songs say," replied Olaf, "for skalds still sing of that deed all over Norway." Olaf's farm. At another time, Harald asked, "What is your country, Olaf? Have you always been a thrall?" The thrall's eyes flashed. "When you are a man," he said, "and go a Viking to Denmark, ask men whether they ever heard of Olaf the Crafty. There, far off, is my country, across the water. My father was Gudbrand the Big. 200 warriors feasted in his hall and followed him to battle. 10 sons ate meat with him, and I was the youngest. One day he said, 'You are all grown to be men. There is not elbow room here for so many chiefs. The eldest of you shall have my farm when I die.' He had 3 ships. These he gave to 3 of my brothers. But I stayed that spring and built me a boat. I made her for only 20 oars, because I thought few men would follow me, for I was young, 15 years old. I made her in the likeness of a dragon. At the prow I carved the head with open mouth and forked tongue thrust out. I painted the eyes red for anger. 'There, stand so,' I said, 'and glare and hiss at my foes.' In the stern I curved the tail up almost as high as the head. There I put the pilot's seat and a strong tiller for the rudder. On the breast and sides I carved the dragon's scales. Then I painted it all black, and on the tip of every scale I put gold. I called her Wave Runner. There she sat on the rollers, as fair a ship as I ever saw. The night that it was finished, I went to my father's feast. After the meats were eaten and the mead horns came round, I stood up from my bench and raised my drinking horn high and spoke with a great voice. 'This is my vow. I will sail to Norway, and I will harry the coast and fill my boat with riches. Then I will get me a farm and will winter in that land. Now who will follow me?' 'He is but a boy,' the man said. 'He has opened his mouth wider than he can do.' But others jumped to their feet with their mead horns in their hands. 30 men, one after another, raised their horns and said, 'I will follow this lad, and I will not turn back so long as he and I live.' On the next morning, we got into my dragon and started. I sat high in the pilot's seat. As our boat flashed down the rollers into the water, I made this song and sang it. 'The dragon runs. Where will she steer? Where swords will sing, where spears will bite, where I shall laugh. So we harried the coast of Norway. We ate at many men's tables uninvited. Many men we found overburdened with gold. Then I said, my dragon's belly is never full, and on board went the gold. Oh, it is better to live on the sea and let other men raise your crops and cook your meals. A house smells of smoke. A ship smells of frolic. From a house, you see a sooty roof. From a ship, you see Valhalla. Up and down the water we went to get much wealth and much frolic. After a while, my men said, what of the farm, Olaf? Not yet, I answered. Viking is better for summer. When the ice comes and our dragon cannot play, then we will get our farm and sit down. At last the winter came, and I said to my men, now for the farm, I have my eye on one up the coast, away in King Halfdan's country. So we set off for it. We landed late at night and pulled our boat up on shore and walked quietly to the house. It was rather a wealthy farm, for there were stables and a storehouse and a smithy at the sides of the house. There was but one door to the house. We went to it, and I struck it with my spear. Hello, ho, hello, I shouted, and my men made a great din. At last, someone from inside said, who calls? I call, I answered. Open, or you will think it Thor who calls. And I struck my shield against the door so that it made a great clanging. The door opened only a little, but I pushed it wide and leaped into the room. It was so dark that I could see nothing but a few sparks on the hearth. I stood with my back to the wall, for I wanted no sword reaching out of the dark for me. Now start up the fire, I said. Come, come, I called, when no one obeyed. A fire. This is cold welcome for your guests. My men laughed. Yes, a stingy host. He acts as though he had not expected us. But now the farmer was blowing on the coals and putting on fresh wood. Soon it blazed up, and we could see about us. We were in a little feast hall with its fire down the middle of it. There were benches for 20 men along each side. The farmer crouched by the fire, afraid to move. On a bench in a far corner were a dozen people huddled together. Ho, thralls, I called to them. Bring in the table. We are hungry. Off they ran through a door at the back of the hall. My men came in and lay down by the fire and warmed themselves. But I set 2 of them as guards at the door. Well, friend farmer, laughed one. Why such a long face? Do you not think we shall be merry company? We came only to cheer you, said another. What man wants to spend the winter with no guests? Ah, another then cried out, sitting up. Here comes something that will be a welcome guest to my stomach. The thralls were bringing in a great pot of meat. They set up a crane over the fire and hung the pot upon it, and we sat and watched it boil while we joked. At last the supper began. The farmer sat gloomily on the bench and would not eat. And you cannot wonder, for he saw us putting potfuls of his good beef and basket loads of bread into our big mouths. When the tables were taken out and the mead horns came round, I stood up and raised my horn and said to the farmer, "You would not eat with us. You cannot say no to half my ale. I drink this to your health." Then I drank half of the hornful and sent the rest across the fire to the farmer. He took it and smiled, saying, "Since it is to my health, I will drink it. I thought that all of this night's work would be my death." "Oh, do not fear that," I laughed, "for a dead man sets no tables." So we drank, and all grew merrier. At last I stood up and said, "I like this little taste of your